The town sat between two worlds. In the mornings, ancestral drums echoed faintly from distant compounds, while motorbikes roared past dusty paths, carrying young men chasing modern dreams. Old trees still stood where elders once poured libations, yet mobile phones rang beneath their shade. The land remembered the footsteps of ancestors, even as new roads tried to erase them. Women greeted the sun with prayers taught by their grandmothers, while children spoke of cities they had never seen. Nothing was said aloud, but everyone felt it, the quiet struggle between what had always been and what people now wanted to become. When the wind moved through the village at night, it carried more than dust. It carried whispers. Stories of forbidden wealth floated from mouth to mouth, never spoken loudly, never owned by anyone. Elders warned during gatherings, their voices calm but firm. Some doors are closed for a reason, they would say. Gold taken in darkness burns the hands. Yet after those meetings, a few young men lingered behind, listening harder than they should. The village had seen it before. Men who were poor one season and rich the next, men whose houses grew taller while their families grew quiet. Every rise had been followed by a fall, though time tried to bury the truth. Poverty walked openly in the village, but dignity did not always survive it. A man without money was greeted last, if at all. His words carried little weight, his presence even less. Respect did not sit with character anymore. It sat with shiny shoes, new roofs, and full plates. Poor men became shadows at community meetings, laughed at by boys and pitted by women who once believed in them. Each ignored greeting, each mocking smile, planted a seed of bitterness deep in waiting hearts. Among those hearts was one that beat with big dreams and quiet pain. The man rose before dawn each day, chasing work that slipped through his fingers like dry sand. His hands were strong, his back willing, yet nothing stayed. When he failed, he laughed it off in public, but at night his chest burned with shame. He felt smaller each day, less of a man in the eyes of the village. A man must provide, voices echoed around him, elders, peers, even his own thoughts. Slowly, frustration hardened into anger, and anger into something darker. Still, there was one place where gentleness lived. His girlfriend believed in patience the way others believed in money. She spoke of small beginnings and honest steps. "We will rise slowly," she often told him, her voice steady. "The ground is firm for those who walk it truthfully." She carried hope like water in a calabash, careful not to spill it. To her, love was work, and time was not the enemy. But as his desperation grew, her calm words began to sound like delay. Where she saw tomorrow, he saw only today slipping away. And in that space between them, silence slowly learned to speak. In the village, eyes were always watching. Nothing stayed hidden for long. Women leaned over low fences, pretending to sweep while their ears followed every passing story. Men gathered under mango trees, laughing loudly about their successes, letting their voices travel far so failure could hear them. When someone built a new house or bought a new motorcycle, the village sang their praise. "He has made it," people said. But when a man stumbled, his struggle became a form of entertainment. Fingers pointed softly, smiles curved with pity, and comparisons were made without mercy. The man felt those looks on his back every time he walked past. Even silence judged him. Without speaking, the community pushed him, step by step, toward the edge. In the evenings, when the air cooled and elders gathered, old stories returned like spirits that never fully left. Voices lowered when talk turned to forbidden paths. "Not all wealth comes with blessings," one elder warned, tapping his walking stick into the dust. Another added, "What is taken from the dark never sleeps in peace." These stories were never told fully, only in pieces, like broken calabashes. Children were sent away, but the words stayed behind. Though many laughed and called the elders fearful, the warnings clung to the air. Tradition stood there, half shield, half temptation, waiting to see who would respect it and who would test it. Inside the man, a battle raged without sound. When he looked at his girlfriend, his heart softened. Her presence reminded him of who he once hoped to be. Yet hunger spoke louder each day. The empty room, the unpaid debts, the mocking eyes of the village all pressed against his chest. "Am I a man if I cannot provide?" he asked himself in the quiet. Love pulled him one way, pride another. Between them, his spirit stretched thin, ready to tear. Then he noticed changes. Men who once sat beside him in dust now passed in clean clothes. Houses rose where grass once grew. Smiles became wider, greetings louder. Their success felt sudden, almost unnatural. He watched closely, pretending not to care. But envy woke slowly inside him, whispering that patience was for fools and luck favored the bold. Soon, rumors began to move like snakes through tall grass. People spoke of ways to rise without sweat, of rituals that turned poverty into wealth overnight. No one claimed to believe them, yet everyone listened. The man listened too. And in his heart, a small voice said, "Maybe this is the way." That was when the seed of greed broke the soil, stretching its roots toward his thoughts, preparing to grow. The woman's hands rested lightly on the edge of the wooden table, her eyes soft, her voice steady. "We will manage," she said, brushing crumbs from the worn cloth. "Tomorrow will be better. We must keep faith." But he could hear only the growl of his own stomach, the hollow echo of empty bowls. Hunger had become more than a need. It had settled into his chest, curling around his heart like a cold snake. Each day without enough to eat made the walls of the small hut feel smaller, tighter, as if the house itself judged him. Poverty was no longer silent. It spoke with every creaking floorboard, every sigh of the wind through the gaps in the roof. He tried again that morning. The first door refused to open. The second, the third, each employer shook their head or found another reason to turn him away. "Try again next week," one said, smiling politely but without hope. Each rejection pressed heavily on his chest. Hope, once steady, slipped slowly through his fingers, leaving behind bitterness that tasted of dust and disappointment. The streets themselves seemed to mock him, the laughter of others a sharp edge against his back. When he walked through the village, whispers followed him like shadows. Children snickered, neighbors smiled faintly with pity or amusement. Men who had once greeted him warmly now nodded curtly, keeping distance. Even women he had known all his life cast quick, assessing glances at his worn shoes and threadbare shirt. Pride, that invisible cloak of dignity, was torn in places no one could see. Each step forward became a reminder that he was measured not by his heart or his work, but by the gold he did not hold. One evening, he approached the elders for advice, hoping for guidance, a way to steady himself. But their eyes, once warm with understanding, now flickered past him like shadows on a wall. Silence replaced counsel. The words that could have guided him were withheld, intentionally or not. He felt invisible, as if his struggles did not merit attention. Wisdom that had once protected him now seemed a fortress closed to his knock. The village's gaze turned elsewhere, leaving him alone with his hunger, his shame, and the gnawing thought that the woman who loved him might be the only barrier keeping him from darker paths. Her patience, her steady heart, stood silently against the storm that hunger and humiliation were stirring within him. He felt smaller with each passing day. The laughter of men who had climbed higher, the nods of respect given to others while he went unnoticed, it all pressed on him. Once, he had stood proud, shoulders straight, chin lifted. Now, he moved through the village like a shadow, shrinking into the corners, hoping no one would measure him against those who had gold and houses. Manhood, he realized bitterly, was no longer tied to character, skill, or heart. It was counted in coins, in cattle, in the strength of one's possessions. And with each comparison, a part of him crumbled, leaving behind someone he barely recognized. She approached him one evening, carrying the scent of fresh maize and morning prayers. "We must hold on," she said gently, placing her hand over his. Slow steps still reached the river. Her words, soft as the wind through the old trees, should have comforted him. Instead, they grated. Patience sounded like weakness in a world that demanded speed, that measured a man by the swiftness of his rise. Her calm faith mocked the fire building in his chest. "Do you not see?" he asked, voice tight with frustration. "Hard work is not enough. Others rise overnight, and we remain here." She did not answer with anger. Only a quiet, steady gaze, reminding him that love was not currency, and faith was not gold. But the seed of resentment had already taken root. Her optimism, once a balm to his weary soul, now felt like a burden. He began to notice the weight of her words in a new light, as if her hope demanded he fail if she could not. Nights became colder, her gentle encouragement turning into quiet irritations in his mind. Emotional distance grew between them like a river widening without warning, and he realized he was moving away from the warmth that had once kept him anchored. As darkness settled over the village, whispers drifted through the streets like smoke. Men spoke in hushed tones of rituals that promised sudden wealth, of secrets that had been passed down from generations too afraid to repeat them openly. "It is dangerous," one said, eyes darting toward shadows. "But some have tried, and the rivers remembered their names." The idea of riches without toil began to hum in the man's ears. Each word, each story, sounded like a drumbeat calling him closer. Darkness, once simply absence of light, began to sound like opportunity. But the elders would not be silenced. At the village square, they gathered, leaning on sticks worn smooth by years, voices grave. "A man who steps beyond the laws of the ancestors invites spirits that never sleep," one warned. "Bloodlines are broken when greed guides the heart." Yet the younger men laughed, tossing insults at fear itself, dismissing the warnings as relics of a timid past. Tradition, though still present, was ignored, standing at a crossroads while desire whispered from every shadow. And the man, caught between patience and temptation, felt the first pull of a path from which there might be no return. Each night, while the village slept, he slipped quietly into the shadows, following paths that no one spoke of openly. Doors closed behind him, voices hushed, and each step felt heavier than the last. The whispers of rituals, once faint stories told at the edge of fires, now guided him. Curiosity that had been mild became obsession, a quiet drumbeat in his chest that would not be silenced. "I only need to know," he told himself, tracing the same narrow paths again and again, each journey pulling him further from the light he once walked in. Morality was a distant village he could see but no longer reach. When he returned home, her eyes met his and held him in place. She smiled, hands still from the work of the day, trusting him as she always had. But he could not look back with ease. Her faith in him shone a light on the shadow growing inside his heart. He felt it there, sharp and biting, guilt wrestling with desire. "I am doing this for us," he whispered to himself, though the lie felt wet on his tongue. He could see she believed him, and that belief both comforted and crushed him. In the quiet of the night, he told himself stories to quiet the conscience that would not rest. "It is only a ritual," he said to the darkness. "It will bring wealth. Nothing will harm her." He imagined love as something temporary, something to protect by bending it to his will. Greed took on the face of duty, whispered that sacrifices could be measured and managed. "We will be safe. I will keep her unharmed," he promised himself, though every instinct whispered caution. He convinced himself that control could make darkness obedient. Every careful step, every calculated measure, became a shield against the fear gnawing at his heart. "If I am cautious, it cannot go wrong," he murmured, tracing the lines of the ritual in his mind. The very thought of betrayal was softened, wrapped in careful planning, like a knife sheathed until it was needed. And yet, the line had already been drawn in the soil of his conscience. Crossing it now felt inevitable, almost natural. She slept nearby, unaware of the storm growing in his heart. Her breath was even, her hands folded loosely, trusting wholly in him. Innocence, fragile and luminous, filled the room. It was her trust, shining so brightly, that made the darkness in him sharper. Betrayal moved quietly in her shadow, patient and knowing, while she remained unaware. Love, the one thing that could have protected them both, now stood as the gate he was ready to push open. He spoke less and moved faster, as if every second wasted was a threat. When she offered gentle words, he answered with sharpness, his voice cutting through the quiet of their home. "Do not slow me," he snapped one evening, hands clenched on the edge of the table. Behind the irritation was something darker, something he did not name even to himself. Guilt twisted inside him, hiding behind impatience and coldness. Each harsh word was a shield, each distant glance a mask to cover what he feared in the silence of his own heart. She looked at him, waiting for tenderness that no longer came. Where love had once been shared, he now calculated, planned, and measured. Her smiles, her hope, her steady presence, all became instruments in the machine of his ambition. "I must do this," he murmured to the empty room. In his mind, she was no longer a partner, no longer a keeper of his heart. She was a step, a key, a tool toward a goal he convinced himself justified every cruelty. The human part of him shrank beneath the weight of his plan. At night, sleep brought no refuge. Dreams twisted around him like dark vines. He saw shadows of ancestors speaking through shapes in firelight, their eyes unblinking, mouths moving without sound. He woke with sweat on his brow, every instinct warning him that the path he walked carried more than risk, it carried a curse. The quiet of the house felt heavy, the air thick, as though the spirits themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see if he would turn back or fall deeper. Even the land began to signal its unease. Birds no longer sang at dawn, chickens remained still in their coops. The wind, which once played through the tall grasses, fell silent. He noticed the elephant's distant calls gone, the rustle of the bush missing. The world seemed to shrink around him, nature pausing to observe, as if it had learned the heart of the man and disapproved. Each subtle sign of unrest in the world pressed on him, a silent reminder that life is watched by more than human eyes. The imbalance within him spread like a shadow across the village. The land, the ancestors, and the traditions held silent court, judging each step, each decision. He could feel it in the soil beneath his feet, in the heavy air that refused to shift, in the quiet eyes of the trees that had seen generations rise and fall. Darkness had claimed the path he now walked, and he felt it claiming him too. Every choice edged him further into a world where morality was a memory, and ambition a consuming fire. And yet, in his mind, betrayal was necessity. Every just thought, every pang of conscience, he smothered with the argument that survival demanded it. "We cannot remain as we are," he said to himself, pacing in the dim room. "I have no choice." Greed whispered in his ear, wrapping his desire in the cloak of responsibility. The more he listened, the more the line between right and wrong blurred, until morality felt distant, irrelevant, and the man he had been was almost forgotten. Ambition had become survival, and survival justified everything. The night draped over the village like a heavy cloak, thicker and darker than any ordinary evening. The usual chorus of insects and distant animal calls was absent, replaced by a silence so deep it felt alive. Even the wind seemed to pause, carrying the scent of wet earth and the faint tang of smoke from far-off fires. Houses stood still, their shadows stretching long and uneasy across the dusty paths. It was as if the village itself held its breath, knowing that something unnatural stirred. Somewhere between the huts and the forests, the night itself became a witness to a choice that would change everything. He moved quietly, boots crunching softly against the dirt path that led to the place elders had warned him never to enter. The entrance loomed, hidden among thick roots and thorned bushes, a space that carried stories of spirits and ancestors. Fear coiled in his stomach, but determination pushed him forward. The path behind him faded into darkness, leaving retreat impossible. "It must be done," he muttered under his breath, feeling the weight of both tradition and desperation pressing on him. Every step into the shadowed clearing felt like stepping further from the man he once was. The sacred ground lay before him, etched with the marks of ancestors, stones worn smooth by generations of reverence. And yet, he began, carefully at first, then with growing resolve, defiling it with his presence and intent. Incense burned in his mind, spirits whispering warnings that he chose to ignore. His hands disturbed soil that had been hallowed, feet that traced paths meant to remain untouched. The earth held its memory, recording each act silently, a witness to the disrespect of centuries. "I need this," he whispered, though even in saying it, the words sounded hollow. Finally, there was no turning back. Every hesitation had been shed, replaced with the certainty of greed. He committed fully, following the ritual exactly as he had learned in hushed tones and secret texts. Mercy, once a possibility, slipped like sand through his fingers. His heartbeat thundered, mingling with the faint rustle of unseen spirits. "It is done," he said aloud, and even as he spoke, a cold shiver traced the line of his spine. The choice was made. His heart had hardened, sealed by desire and ambition. Confidence, once bright and proud, crumbled immediately as the night responded to his transgression. Shadows twisted where none should have, and a cold that had no origin wrapped around him. The air hummed with a presence he could not command, and every careful calculation felt foolish and small. Fear rose like a tide, drowning certainty. He reached for the power he thought he would control, only to find that it had its own mind, indifferent and merciless. For the first time, he understood that the forces he sought to master were not bargains, and that confidence without respect was a dangerous illusion. The moment he began, the ritual seemed to shift under his hands. The steps he had memorized so carefully, the words he had whispered to himself, felt suddenly wrong. The chants wavered, and the patterns he thought were safe twisted into shapes unfamiliar and threatening. A cold dread filled his chest as he realized he had awoken something older than memory, something that did not bend to human hands. "No, it should not be like this," he whispered, but the night offered no answer. Every careful motion now seemed fragile, as if the earth itself were holding its breath in disapproval. She stood at the edge of the circle, a presence so pure it seemed to shine against the shadows that pressed in. Every movement, every glance she made carried a weight he could no longer ignore. Her innocence became a mirror, reflecting the corruption he had embraced. The love he had promised to protect now faced the darkness he had chosen, and the clash of light and shadow felt unbearable. I didn't mean for this," he murmured, though he knew it was too late. Betrayal had already walked beside him, and she was the axis upon which it turned. The air grew sharp and bitter, cutting through the night with sudden intensity. A chill spread over the clearing, causing his breath to rise in misty clouds. He felt them before he saw them, spiritual presences, drawn by the violation of the sacred. The night itself seemed to pulse, heavy with judgment and expectation. The unseen hovered close, unseen yet undeniable, and every instinct told him that forces older than men were gathering. "What have I done?" he whispered, shivering despite the heavy clothes clinging to his skin. Then came the sounds, fractured and wrong, twisting the darkness into shapes he could not name. Whispers that spoke in broken tongues swirled around him, and echoes bounced in impossible directions. They were voices that did not belong to the living, voices that belonged to the Watchers, the guardians of law and bloodline. Fear spread through him like wildfire, uncontained, as though the night itself had found its voice and was calling his name in accusation. "Stop! Please!" he begged, but the voices only multiplied, laughing and whispering in turns. Panic rose as he realized the truth. The ritual no longer answered to him. The careful steps, the whispered promises, the protective measures, all illusions. The power he sought had its own will, indifferent and merciless. He tried to call it back, to regain control, but his hands moved in futility. The earth trembled faintly beneath him, the winds whispered curses, and even the shadows seemed to shift on their own accord. "It is too late," he murmured, heart hammering. The force he had unleashed was beyond bargaining, beyond understanding. Human hands had played with what they were never meant to touch, and now the ritual followed its own path, heedless of desire or fear. The moment the ritual spiraled beyond his control, clarity struck him like a spear. The ancient laws were not suggestions, and spirits did not negotiate. Every whispered promise, every careful incantation he had learned, fell into silence before the weight of something far older than men. He realized too late that wealth had never been the price. It had been a lure, a shadow meant to blind him. The spirits demanded balance, and balance was measured not in coins or land, but in what he had taken from the sacred order of life. "What have I done?" he murmured, voice trembling against the darkness. The ritual revealed its true cost, far beyond any treasure he had imagined. It asked for something intangible yet absolute, something that could not be repaid or replaced. Loss came in forms that money could never touch, leaving emptiness where ambition had once burned. The law of the ancestors required justice, bloodless yet uncompromising, leaving him to witness suffering without relief. "No, it cannot be," he whispered, as the weight of consequence pressed on his chest. She stood in the circle, once a symbol of hope and love, now trembling under the shadow of his choices. Innocence could not survive the breach of trust, and she suffered where he had acted. Every heartbeat of hers felt like a drum of accusation, and he could only watch, frozen, as ambition exacted a price no man could escape. "Please, forgive me," he begged, but the wind carried his words away, and the night answered only with silence. His eyes could not leave the outcome, clear and irreversible. Nothing could mend the chasm his greed had carved. The world seemed to pause, holding the weight of what had been done, and he felt the full measure of his error. Every instinct screamed that this was permanent, that no plea, no offering, could change the course. Reality settled like a heavy stone, pressing into his chest, and for the first time, he understood the full scope of his act. Regret arrived like a storm, shattering the last remnants of pride and desire. The gold and wealth he had sought now felt like dust in his hands. Each coin was a reminder of betrayal, each promise of fortune a lie to his own soul. His heart broke beneath the weight of guilt, and the silence of the night became a mirror, reflecting a man who had traded love for ambition and found nothing but ruin. "It was never worth it, never worth it," he whispered, and the wind seemed to answer with a mournful sigh. The truth hit him like the sharp crack of a dry branch underfoot. He had thought love could be bargained, that hearts could be weighed and traded for silver and gold. But he now understood that love is not a coin to be spent, nor a ladder to climb. The elders' warnings whispered through memory, clear as the first drumbeat at sunrise. Tradition punishes disrespect, and those who blind themselves with greed see nothing but emptiness in the end. He fell to his knees, the cold earth biting at his skin, his eyes staring at the lifeless stillness around him, knowing the folly of human ambition. Fate did not pause to console or explain. Judgment arrived in silence, impartial and complete. The ritual fulfilled its purpose, delivering consequences precise and unyielding. He could feel the weight of the scales tipping, unseen hands restoring balance at a cost that burned in his chest. Nothing was excused, nothing forgotten, and no tear could reverse what had been done. The night seemed to hum with authority, and even the winds carried the final verdict of ancestors long gone. The sacred laws, older than any man's desire, stood undefeated. Darkness that had been coaxed and courted receded slowly, leaving only the ruin of choices made in haste and pride. Bones of earth, shadows of trees, and the lingering chill of the air seemed to mark the boundaries of what could never be undone. Every breath he drew reminded him that human will bows to the strength of ancient decree, and the price for defiance had been paid in full. Though his heart still beat, he was no longer whole. Survival had become its own punishment, a hollow echo of life without joy or relief. The man wandered through the village as though a ghost among living flesh, his eyes reflecting the emptiness inside. Every step reminded him of love lost, of innocence betrayed, and of ambition that had devoured him from within. To live, yet never truly survive, became the cruelest sentence of all. Riches arrived as foretold, coins and treasures glinting under the weak sun, yet they brought no comfort. Each coin felt like cold iron pressing against his palm, every note heavier than the last. Pride refused to awaken, joy had been exiled, and the weight of what he had sacrificed made every possession a curse. He understood now that wealth without honor is nothing, that money without heart is emptiness, and that the true cost of greed is measured in the spirit, not in silver or gold. The nights had grown heavy with shadows, each one darker than the last. He lay awake, staring at the thatched ceiling, yet it offered no comfort. Memories clawed at him, her laughter, the trust in her eyes, the warmth of hands he could no longer hold. Silence surrounded him, yet it spoke louder than any voice, echoing the absence of what he had destroyed. Sleep, once a haven, betrayed him. It brought only visions of what might have been and whispers of what could not be undone. Each sigh of wind through the village trees seemed to mock his attempts at peace, carrying the echoes of cries unanswered, the weight of a love betrayed. The villagers noticed the change. He walked among them, yet he was no longer one of their own. Familiar faces now carried a cautionary glance, and even friends stepped lightly around him. Fear hung in the air like smoke from a fire long extinguished. He felt the sharp sting of isolation as whispers followed him down every path, eyes watching, judging, yet no words were spoken to his face. Trust had vanished, leaving him adrift in a sea of silent condemnation. Stories traveled faster than truth ever could. Fragments of the tragedy slipped through open windows, over fences, and into ears eager to know without asking. The town learned in pieces, in snippets, in looks exchanged at market stalls. Mothers held their children closer, men lowered their voices in the gathering huts, and the tale spread like fire across dry grass. Everyone knew, yet no one spoke plainly, for fear that the wind might carry accusations to the wrong ears. Elders gathered under the moon's pale glow, their eyes heavy with the weight of memory. They spoke not with fingers pointed, nor names named, but with proverbs carved from the wisdom of generations. "He who breaks the path of the ancestors walks in shadows," one said, his voice low yet resonant. Young men listened, unsure, while the women nodded, absorbing the lesson in quiet respect. Tradition reclaimed its voice, not with anger, but with a measured cadence of truth repeated, teaching what words alone could not convey. Her name became a whisper of warning, spoken softly in kitchens and by firesides. Mothers repeated her story to daughters, not in anger, but in care, shaping it into a shield meant to protect others from repeating the mistakes of ambition and greed. Her memory lingered in every gentle caution, a reminder that innocence, once lost, leaves a mark deeper than the visible scars of the world. Love had paid its price, and the village remembered. He carried guilt like a shadow, always at his shoulder, growing longer with every step. Even when the sun shone, it could not reach the darkness in his chest. Each path reminded him of her face, each sound echoed the cries that had gone unanswered. His own reflection, once a familiar friend, now revealed the hollow of a man stripped of hope and honor. Memory became his prison, and conscience his relentless jailer. No matter how far he walked, he could not outrun what he had done, for it walked beside him, silent but ever present, shaping his every moment. The village no longer looked at him as one of its own. Faces that once smiled now lowered with quiet judgment. The respect he had once thought so easily won had vanished, slipping through his fingers like water. He wandered past the marketplace, where elders spoke in whispers, and children's laughter turned to stares, sharp and unyielding. The bonds that tied him to the land and its people unraveled, leaving him stranded. Belonging, once a gentle comfort, became a memory too painful to summon. His heart, heavy with shame, knew no peace. Even the wind through the trees seemed to carry judgment, rustling like the whispers of ancestors disappointed by his choices. Gold lay before him, heavy in sacks, yet it no longer glimmered with promise. The coins felt cold, the wealth meaningless in a life stripped of honor. He touched the treasures, imagining triumph, but only emptiness replied. The laughter of others, their joy at his sudden fortune, rang hollow in his ears. He had learned too late that riches cannot mend a broken spirit, that no amount of wealth could restore the warmth of love lost or the respect he had traded for it. Even the finest fabrics, the grandest houses, offered no comfort to a soul hollowed by betrayal. Each day became a slow toll of suffering. He rose, worked, counted coins, and yet found no relief. Fate had chosen endurance over mercy, a punishment measured not in death but in unending consequence. Every step he took reminded him of the bridge burned, every voice in the village a silent echo of what he had destroyed. He lived among the living, yet each sunrise carried the weight of a debt he could never repay. Pain had become his companion, guilt his shadow, and the passage of time a relentless judge. He knelt once, hands pressed to the earth, voice trembling. "I am sorry," he whispered into the soil, into the winds that carried his words to the ancestors. Forgiveness, perhaps, could be spoken, but the loss remained. Love once given freely had been betrayed, and the heart that had trusted him now lay broken. Redemption, fragile and late, could not undo the hurt carved into the lives of those he cherished. The elders shook their heads, voices solemn as they recited proverbs. "The tree that is cut down cannot grow again," one said, and the young ones listened. Tradition, steadfast and unyielding, proved stronger than tears. Sacred laws, older than any man, could not be bent by regret or pleas. Balance returned to the village, yet scars remained, reminders that some actions echo longer than a single lifetime, carried forward in story and memory. Mothers spoke softly to daughters by the fireside, "True wealth is not taken from the heart of another. Greed opens the door to darkness. Respect the paths of those who came before, for a man who betrays love for riches inherits neither peace nor honor." And so, the lesson traveled from mouth to ear, from heart to heart. The man lived, but as a caution, a living testament that some choices can never be unmade, and that the ancestors' laws, though invisible, shape the world more surely than any human desire.